Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to discuss one of the so-called difficult topics for the medical students, and that is the cardiac cycle. Why cardiac cycle becomes difficult for the medical students is that they don't try to understand the sequence of events which are happening in the cardiac cycle, and they just try to by heart the cardiac cycle. So when you try to by heart the cardiac cycle, it becomes very difficult to write the events which are occurring in the cardiac cycle in a sequential manner. So if we understand the events which are occurring in a cardiac cycle in a sequential manner, it's going to become very easy, and that's my job. So I bet you by the end of this video, the cardiac cycle is going to become very easy, and all of you who are watching this video, 100% you are going to write this answer if it is coming in your exams, okay? And at the end of the cardiac cycle, initially we will discuss all the stages of the cardiac cycle, definition and duration. And the end of the cardiac cycle, I'm also discussing what is called as a Vigors diagram. So what is this Vigors diagram? Vigors diagram is nothing but wherein you will see a graphical representation of the changes in the pressure, of the changes in the volume which is occurring in the ventricles, and also the associated changes like the electrocardiographic changes and the heart sounds which are produced during one event of the cardiac cycle. So stay tuned till the end of this video so as to understand the cardiac cycle in the most simplest and the best way possible. Okay, so without wasting much time, let's start cardiac cycle. So we are going to discuss cardiac cycle under these subheadings because you are supposed to write all these things if it is asked. And mind you, it's a long essay for first year MBBS students. So okay, so the cardiac cycle is discussed under definition, understanding the definition, what is the meaning of the word systole and diastole, what is the duration of the cardiac cycle, and then coming to the main part of the cardiac cycle, that is the stages or the events. So events are categorized into two subheadings. One is the atrial events, another one is the ventricular events. And then in these events, the most important thing that we are supposed to understand is the pressure and the volume changes which are occurring in each cycle, and this is more so with the left ventricular pressure rather than the right ventricular. So pressure changes which are occurring in the left ventricle is what we are going to study. Okay, so let's just start with the definition. So how can we define cardiac cycle? Cardiac cycle is nothing but the cardiac events that occur from the beginning of one heartbeat to the beginning of the next heartbeat. So the events that are occurring from one heartbeat to the next heartbeat. So what are these events which are occurring? These events are basically two types of events. One is what is called as mechanical events. Okay. Another one is what is called as electrical events. Okay, the mechanical events and the electrical events. So in the mechanical events, of course, we have changes which are occurring with relation to pressure, the changes which are occurring with relation to volume, the changes which are occurring with the opening and closing of valves, opening and the closing of valves. And then electrical events are nothing but the changes which are occurring in the electrocardiogram. Okay, so this is the definition of the cardiac cycle. So what do we understand by these words systole and diastole? Everybody knows this. What is the meaning of systole? Systole is nothing but wherein there is contraction of heart. There is contraction of heart. Okay, so what happens during contraction of the heart? During contraction of the heart, the blood is pumped. The blood is pumped. Okay, so it can be related to atrial systole or it can be related to ventricular systole. If there is atrial systole, the blood from the atria is pumped into the ventricle, both the ventricles, and if there is ventricular systole, the blood from the ventricles is pumped into the larger arteries like the aorta and the pulmonary artery. Okay, so this is one phase of the cardiac cycle. And then what do we understand by the word diastole? Diastole is nothing but relaxation of the heart. Relaxation of the heart. So when I am telling heart, it is actually the myocardium. So what is happening during the relaxation of the heart? During the relaxation of the heart is filling up with blood. The heart is filling up with blood. If I say ventricular systole, then the ventricles are receiving the blood from the atria. And if I say atrial systole, then the atria are receiving blood from the veins. The right atrium is receiving blood from the superior and the inferior vena cava, and the left atrium is receiving the oxygenated blood from the pulmonary veins. So this is what's the meaning of systole and diastole. Next, let's go to the duration of the cardiac cycle. See, one very important thing that we have to remember regarding the cardiac cycle is that the atrial events as well as the ventricular events, they are occurring simultaneously. Let's say when the atria is contracting, at that point of time the ventricle is relaxing. And let's say when the ventricle is contracting or ventricle is in the phase of systole, at that point of time the atria are relaxing. So both are occurring simultaneously. It's not like atrial events are occurring first and then the ventricular events are occurring. If you are thinking in that way, then you are absolutely wrong. Simultaneously, atrial events as well as the ventricular events are taking place. So the total duration of the cardiac cycle is said to be 0.8 seconds. A very important point to remember. The total duration of the cardiac cycle is 0.8 seconds. So out of these 0.8 seconds, as you are seeing in the diagram, this one what you are seeing here, this is the atrial event. So AS means atrial systole, and the remaining part which is see here in blue, it is the atrial diastole. That means the atrial events occur over a period of 0.8 seconds. Okay, out of this, the atrial systole is for zero point 0.1 seconds and the atrial diastole is for remaining 0.7 seconds. As you are seeing here, the time given for atrial diastole is more compared to that of the atrial systole. Similarly, simultaneously, ventricular events are also happening, and ventricular events also happen over a period of 0.8 seconds. Here you are seeing, see this red color thing is the ventricular systole. What is happening from here to here? So here the ventricular systole is lasting for 0.3 seconds and the ventricular diastole is lasting for the remaining 0.5 seconds. So this is the total duration of the cardiac cycle. And always remember one more thing is that the duration of the cardiac cycle is inversely proportional to the heart rate. That means if the heart rate is increasing, then the duration of the cardiac cycle is going to decrease. And if the heart rate is decreasing, then the duration of the cardiac cycle is going to increase. Okay, and in this duration we have both systole as well as diastole. In this, the more which is affected is the diastole. Let's say the heart rate is going to increase. So what is going to happen to the duration of the cardiac cycle? It is going to decrease. So that means there is a decrease for both systole as well as for diastole, but the decrease in diastole is more compared to the decrease in the systole. So if the decrease in the diastole is more, that means what is happening? There is less time for the heart to relax. So if the heart is not relaxing properly, the input, that is the filling of the heart, is not occurring properly. So if the filling of the heart is not occurring properly, then the amount of blood the heart is going to pump out will be less. So we all know that the amount of blood which the ventricles are going to pump out is called as stroke volume if it is per beat, and it is called as cardiac output if it is per minute. So which is going to suffer here? Ultimately the cardiac output is going to suffer. So this is the relationship of duration of the cardiac cycle with the heart rate. So the underlining point is that the heart rate, or the duration of the cardiac cycle is inversely proportional to the heart rate. Heart rate increases, duration decreases. Heart rate decreases, the duration is going to increase. So the total duration of the cardiac cycle is how much? 0.8 seconds. We have two things which are happening simultaneously. That means duration of atrial cardiac cycle is also 0.8 seconds, in which 0.1 second is atrial systole and 0.7 second is atrial diastole. Duration of the ventricular cardiac cycle is also 0.8 seconds, in which 0.3 seconds is ventricular systole and 0.5 seconds is ventricular diastole. So this is regarding the duration of the cardiac cycle. So now let's come to the stages of the cardiac cycle, or the events which are occurring in the cardiac cycle. So we will divide the events into two parts. One is the atrial events, another one is the ventricular events. So first let's discuss the atrial events. So in the atrial events there are two things which are happening. What are the two things? One is called as atrial systole. Another one is called as atrial diastole. Okay, atrial diastole. Atrial diastole we need not discuss in detail, because atrial diastole is an ongoing process during which important ventricular events are taking place. So what is happening during atrial diastole? The only thing that we are going to write in the exam is that during the atrial diastole, the atria is filling with the blood. Okay, the right atria is allowing the blood to come from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, and the left atria is allowing the blood to come from the pulmonary vein. So atrial filling is occurring. Thing which we are supposed to discuss here is that atrial systole. Let's just understand what is happening in the heart. So now we will start from that stage. Let's say a very simple diagram I am going to draw. This is the heart. Okay, don't mind, I am drawing in the form of a rectangle. Then okay, this is the heart. This is our left atrium. This is our left ventricle. This is our right atrium, and this is our right ventricle. Now what is happening here is that we will start with that stage wherein the atrioventricular valves, these are the atrioventricular valves which are present between the atria and the ventricles, they are open. Okay, when there is opening of the atrioventricular valve, remember that 80% of the blood from the atria enters into the ventricles passively. That means I don't need active contraction of the atria to push the blood from the atria into the ventricles. So 80% of the blood, as soon as the atrioventricular valves open, moves from the atria into the ventricle without any contribution of the atria. Now, the remaining 20% of the blood, which is still there in the atria, for that blood to enter into the ventricle, I need the contraction of the atria on both the sides. This is what is the contribution of the atrial systole. So the first and foremost point that we are supposed to write in our exams regarding the atrial systole is that you can just explain as to what is atrial systole. Atrial systole is nothing but the contraction of atria. The contraction of the atria. So what is happening during the contraction of the atria? Only 20% of blood from the atria is entering into the ventricles. Why? Because the remaining 80% of the blood has already gone without the contribution coming from the atria. Second point. Okay. Third point is that we should always remember that we are talking regarding two changes which are occurring in the cardiac cycle with respect to the ventricle. One is ventricular pressure, another one is ventricular volume. What is happening to the ventricular pressure and what is happening to the ventricular volume? So now when the blood from the atria is entering into the ventricles, what happens to the ventricular pressure? There is a slight increase in the ventricular pressure. Slight increase in the ventricular pressure. What is happening to the blood volume? 80% of the blood volume has already entered into the ventricles. remaining 20% has to go. So that means there is also a slight increase in the ventricular volume. So there is a slight increase in the ventricular pressure. There is a slight increase in the ventricular volume. 20% of the blood from the atria is entering into the ventricles. All this is happening because of the contraction of the atria. Fifth very important point which happens during this stage is that because of the contraction of the atria, there is production of the fourth heart sound. There is production of the fourth heart sound. And we all know, okay, the sixth point, we all know that whenever the atria is contracting, atria contraction occurs because of the atrial depolarization, and atrial depolarization is represented as P wave in ECG. It is represented as P wave in ECG. So these are the 6 important events which are happening during the atrial systole. Contraction of the atria occurs, that is what is called as atrial systole. This contraction of the atria is causing the movement of 20% of the blood from the atria into the ventricles. Okay. Because of that, there is a slight increase in the ventricular pressure. There is a slight increase in the ventricular volume, and atria is contracting and it is producing the fourth heart sound, and it is also leading to the generation of the P wave in the ECG. Okay, till now we have finished the atrial events. So what has occurred in the atrial event is that there is an atrial systole which has pumped the remaining 20% of the blood from the atria into the ventricles. Now what is going to happen in the ventricles is that the pressure inside the ventricles is going to increase. Pressure inside the ventricle is going to increase. Now because of an increase in the pressure in the ventricles, in comparison with the atria, the atrioventricular valves on both the sides is going to shut off. Okay, so the first and foremost event which occurs is closure of atrioventricular valve. So this closure of the atrioventricular valve is the one which is going to produce the first heart sound, or also designated as S1, or also designated as S1. Okay, so that's the first thing which is going to occur. So now what has happened? Now the ventricles are completely closed. Why? Because the atrioventricular valve is also closed, as well as the semilunar valve is also closed. So because of that, but what is happening is that the ventricle is continuing to contract. So what does that do? Ventricular pressure inside the ventricles is increasing. But what is happening to the ventricular volume? The ventricular volume is not increasing because the ventricle is now contracting as a closed chamber. So there is no increase in the volume of the ventricles. So this phase is what is called as isovolumic contraction phase. Isovolumic contraction phase. Because there is contraction of the ventricles, what ECG changes can we expect? There should be ventricular depolarization, and ventricular depolarization is what is suggested by the presence of the Vigors complex. So the blood from the atria has entered into the ventricles. There is closure of the atrioventricular valve, resulting in production of the first heart sound. Ventricles begin, or ventricles continue to contract as closed chambers. Thus, there is an increase in the ventricular pressure, but no increase in the ventricular volume. That means the tension in the muscle is increasing, but there is no increase in the volume. Such a kind of ventricular contraction is called as isovolumic contraction phase, and this phase is coinciding with the QRS complex on the ECG. Now what is happening is that the pressure inside the ventricle keeps on increasing. The pressure inside the ventricles increases more than the pressure in the big vessels, that is in the pulmonary artery as well as in the aorta. Now this results in opening of valves which are called as our semilunar valves. Opening of the semilunar valves, that is these valves, as you are seeing here in the diagram, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve, they are going to open. Opening of the semilunar valves causes what? Ejection of the blood from the ventricles into these big vessels. So the next phase which occurs in the ventricular systole is a phase of ejection. And this phase of ejection is divided into two parts. One is called as a rapid ejection, another one is called as a slow ejection. So rapid ejection means as soon as the semilunar valves have opened, rapidly the blood from the ventricles is entering into the big vessels. So what is going to happen here? The ventricular pressure is going to increase because the ventricles are contracting. And what is going to happen to the ventricular volume? The ventricular volume is going to reduce. Why the ventricular volume is reducing? Because the blood from the ventricles is now entering into the big vessels, that is the aorta and the pulmonary artery. And then this rapid ejection of the blood is going to contribute in ejection of 70% of the blood from the ventricles into the big vessels. And then there comes a slow ejection phase wherein the remaining 30% of the blood from the ventricles is ejected out. And during the slow ejection phase, remember this point, the ventricular pressure begins to fall. The ventricular pressure begins to fall. And what happens to the ventricular volume? The ventricular volume also decreasing because 30% of the blood from the ventricles is now pumped into the big vessels. Fine. So in the ventricular systole, very important three events are occurring. One is there is occurring of the first heart sound, which is occurring because of the closure of the atrioventricular valves. Second important thing is there is isovolumetric contraction phase. Third important thing is that there is a ejection phase. There is a ejection phase. Okay. Now the ventricles, after the ventricular systole, there is going to be a ventricular diastole. So now what is going to happen is that after the rapid ejection phase, the blood from the ventricles is pumped into the big arteries. Okay. Now what is going to happen? The pressure inside the ventricles begins to fall. And the pressure inside the pulmonary artery as well as the aorta is very high. So because of this high pressure, there is a chance that the blood from the pulmonary artery and the aorta can seep back into the ventricles. To prevent this seeping back of the blood into the ventricles, there is closure of these valves. So which are these valves? What is going to happen is there is closure of both the semilunar valves. Both the semilunar valves are closed. So closure of the semilunar valve is going to do what? Closure of the semilunar valve is going to produce the second heart sound, which is designated as S2. After the closure of the semilunar valve, now what is happening? The ventricles begin to relax, but the ventricles are relaxing now as a closed chamber. Why I am telling it's a closed chamber? Because there is closure of the semilunar valves as well as there is closure of the atrioventricular valve. So what is happening in the ventricle is that the ventricular pressure inside the ventricle, it begins to fall rapidly. But what is happening to the ventricular volume? The ventricular volume is not going to change. Why? Because now the ventricles are relaxing as a closed chamber. Now this phase of the diastole is what is called as isovolumic relaxation phase. Isovolumic relaxation phase, wherein the ventricular pressure is falling, the ventricular volume is not changing, and the ventricle is relaxing as a closed chamber. Now, the pressure inside the ventricles falls rapidly. It is going to fall rapidly in comparison with the pressure in the atria. Now, what is going to happen is because of this difference in the pressure, there will be opening of atrioventricular valves. That is the valves present in between the atria. See here you are seeing the atrioventricular valve has opened. Now this atrioventricular valve, when it opens, by this time what was happening in the atria? The atria was getting filled. The atria was in the phase of the diastole, so the atria is completely filled with blood. Now the blood from the atria gushes into the ventricles. So this phase of the ventricular diastole is what is called as filling phase. Why do we call it as a filling phase? Because the ventricles are getting filled. The blood from the atria is entering into the ventricles. And this filling phase is further divided into three portions. One is called as rapid filling of the blood. That is, as soon as the gates open, that is, as soon as the valves are opening, the blood from the atria is entering into the ventricles very rapidly, and this rapid filling is the one which is going to produce the third heart sound, which is designated as S3. After the rapid filling, okay, the filling is going to reduce, and that is called as slow filling phase. It is called as the slow filling phase. Remember, both the rapid filling phase as well as the slow filling phase are passive events. What do I mean by passive events? There is no active contraction of the atria which is aiding in movement of the blood from the atrium into the ventricles. And this is by the slow and rapid filling phase, almost 80% of the blood from the atria has now entered into the ventricles. Now for the remaining 20% of the blood which is remaining in the atria, I require active contraction of the atria, and that is what is done by atrial contraction, or also called as the atrial systole, which I have discussed in the very first. And this atrial contraction is aiding in pushing in remaining 20% of the blood from the atria into the ventricles. So the first phase is rapid passive filling phase, the second phase is slow passive filling phase, and the third phase is, in some books it is also called as rapid active filling phase. Okay, rapid active filling phase, which helps in movement of the remaining 20% of the blood from the atria into the ventricles. So it is as simple as that. And now again atrial contraction is going to produce the fourth heart sound. And one more thing which we shouldn't forget here is that, so whenever there is isovolumetric relaxation, there is T wave in the ECG. So what does T wave suggest? T wave is going to tell us that the ventricles are in the phase of repolarization. So when repolarization is occurring, the ventricles are relaxing. As easy as that. Just it is that we have to remember the sequence of events which are occurring. Okay, now let's go to this diagram, and this diagram is what is called as the Vigors diagram. In this Vigors diagram, there is pressure, there is volume. So in the Vigors diagram, basically we are concerned with the pressure changes and the volume changes of the left ventricle. Third thing we will concentrate is the ECG changes. The fourth thing we will concentrate is on the heart sounds. So remember, even when you are writing this diagram in your exams, I am just concerned if you have written the changes occurring in the left ventricle, that is the pressure changes and the volume changes, associated ECG changes, and the heart sounds when they are produced. Okay, so here it is labeled as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it is in the, these are the same stages which I have explained. So the stage 1, as you are seeing here, it is nothing but it's a stage of atrial systole. Atrial systole. So let's just recollect what all happened in the atrial systole. In the atrial systole, what happened is atria contracted. Contraction of the atria resulted in movement of 20% of the blood from the atria into the ventricles. So when the blood has moved from the atria into the ventricles, what happened to the ventricular pressure and the ventricular volume? There is a slight increase in the ventricular pressure, also slight increase in the ventricular volume. Atrial systole has resulted in fourth heart sound. This is one more thing we have to remember, and atrial systole coincides with the P wave of the ECG. So P wave is suggestive of atrial depolarization. So let's just concentrate on this red line. which is suggestive of the left ventricular pressure, and this black line which is suggestive of the left ventricular volume, and then this ECG and the sounds. So the first is atrial systole. So what is happening during atrial systole? Fourth heart sound, because atrial systole, contraction of the atria, produces fourth heart sound. What is happening in the ECG? As here we can see, the atrial systole is coinciding with the P wave of the ECG. And here you can see, let me just trace this. It's something like this. The pressure is slightly increasing. This is how you are supposed to write in your exam. And what has happened to the volume? There is a slight increase in the volume. So all these are the changes which are occurring during the atrial systole. Now what happens after the atrial systole? The ventricle is completely filled with blood. Pressure in the ventricles is high, and this causes closure of the atrioventricular valves. The closure of the atrioventricular valve results in first heart sound, that is S1. And then the ventricular systole is going to begin. So the ventricles begin to contract. So ventricular systole is coinciding with the QRS complex of the ECG. Okay, what is going to happen to the pressure here? As here you can see the red line, the pressure inside the ventricles is increasing. So the second part of this Vigors diagram is what is coinciding with isovolumic contraction phase. Isovolumic contraction phase. So what is happening to the pressure in the isovolumic contraction phase? The pressure is increasing. What is happening to the volume? Here you can see the volume is remaining static. The volume is remaining static. That means there is no increase in the volume of the blood. That's why it is called as isovolumic contraction phase. Now, after the isovolumic contraction phase, pressure inside the ventricle increases so much that it causes opening of the semilunar valves. So, as soon as there is opening of the semilunar valves, the blood is rapidly ejected outside. So, this is called as the phase of rapid ejection. That is what is the third phase is happening. So, what happens in the phase of rapid ejection? In the phase of rapid ejection, the ventricular pressure increases, but what happens to the ventricular volume? The ventricular volume is going to decrease. Why that happens? That is happening because the blood from the ventricles is now entering into the aorta or the pulmonary artery. Here I am dealing with the left ventricle, so I will say aorta. So two things: increase in the pressure, decrease in the volume. After the rapid ejection, there is one more phase which is called as a phase of slow ejection. So the rapid ejection has resulted in pumping 70% of the stroke volume, and the slow ejection is the one which causes pumping of the remaining 30% of the blood from the ventricles into the aorta. So now during slow ejection, as you are seeing, what is happening to the pressure? The pressure is beginning to fall. And what is happening to the volume? The volume is still further reducing, and now the ventricles begin the stage of diastole, and that is what is corresponding with the T wave of the ECG. Okay, so now rapid ejection and slow ejection have occurred. So now what is going to happen is there is going to be the closure of the semilunar valves or the aortic valve. Now the closure of the semilunar valve or the aortic valve is going to produce the second heart sounds. Now the ventricles are completely closed chambers. Here semilunar valve is closed, that side atrioventricular valve is closed, and the ventricles are relaxing continuously. So what is going to happen? The pressure inside the ventricles is going to fall. As here you can see, the pressure is falling. But what has happened to the volume here? As you can see, there is no change in the volume. So the fifth stage as depicted in this diagram is corresponding with isovolumic relaxation phase. Isovolumic relaxation phase, wherein the pressure is decreasing but there is no change in the volume, and then there is appearance of the second heart sound. Once the pressure in the ventricles falls down, okay, then there is opening of the atrioventricular valves. So the opening of the atrioventricular valves is going to cause rapid filling phase. And this rapid filling phase is the sixth phase. What is happening here? There is no much increase in the pressure, very slight increase in the pressure in the ventricles. And because the ventricles are filling, there is a high increase in the volume of the ventricles. The volume of the ventricle goes up. And the rapid filling is the one which is going to produce the third heart sound. Rapid filling phase is the one which is going to produce the third heart sound. Followed by rapid filling, there is the seventh phase which is called as a slow filling phase. Okay, and both these are passive processes. Both these are passive processes. And the rapid and the slow filling phase is causing 80% of the blood from the atria to enter into the ventricles. And the remaining 20% again enters. So after the slow filling, what is going to happen? Again, we are going to the phase of atrial systole. Again, we are going back to the phase of atrial systole, wherein remaining 20% of the blood from the atria is entering into the ventricles. It's as easy as this if we understand these events. Okay, so always remember, start writing the answer from the stage of atrial systole. Okay, in the atrial systole, remember there is P wave, remember there is fourth heart sound, remember 20% of the blood from the atria is pumped into the ventricles. Then come to the stage of ventricular systole. Coinciding with the ventricular systole is closure of the atrioventricular valves and appearance of the first heart sound. Okay, in this there is a phase which is called as isovolumic contraction phase. Okay, wherein you see the appearance of the QRS wave and the ventricular pressure goes up and the ventricular volume remains the same. Once the pressure inside the ventricle is going to increase, what is going to happen? There is going to be opening of the semilunar valve and there is going to be ejection of the blood. Now this ejection of the blood is also a rapid ejection and a slow ejection. Rapid ejection contributes to the ejection of the 70% of the stroke volume. Slow ejection contributes to the ejection of the 30% of the stroke volume. Okay, in the rapid ejection, the ventricular pressure increases, the ventricular volume decreases. In the slow ejection, the ventricular pressure begins to fall and the ventricular volume also decreases. Because there is a fall in the ventricular pressure, there is a high pressure in the aorta, the blood may seep back into the ventricles. Now there is closure of the semilunar valves, and then there is beginning of the stage of ventricular diastole. So closure of the semilunar valve corresponds with the production of the second heart sound, which is S2. Now the ventricle is in diastole, that is the ventricle is contracting, and ventricular contraction is occurring without any change in the volume. So such a kind of ventricle is relaxing and ventricular relaxation is occurring without any change in the volume. Such a kind of relaxation is called as isovolumic relaxation phase. What is happening in the isovolumic relaxation phase? Ventricular pressure is decreasing, ventricular volume is remaining same. After the isovolumetric relaxation phase, the atrioventricular valves are opening and then there is filling of the ventricles. There is rapid filling and then there is slow filling and again there is rapid filling. The first rapid and slow filling are occurring passively and the rapid filling is the one which is resulting in third heart sound and the ventricular diastole is corresponding with the T wave of the ECG. The rapid and the slow filling passive which is occurring, that is resulting in movement of 80% of the blood from the ventricles into the from the atria into the ventricles, and the rapid filling which is occurring because of the atrial contraction or the atrial systole, that is causing 20% of the blood to be ejected from the atria into the ventricles. Okay, as easy as that. In a single paper, within 5 minutes, you can revise the entire cardiac cycle, the pressure changes, the volume changes, the electrocardiographic events, and the production of the heart sound. Always start with the systole and then follow where all the blood is going and what all events can happen. If you have understood this, I bet there is no need for you to go and read this topic again from your textbook. So thanks for watching this video completely. If you have really understood this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to my channel, and keep waiting for more such concept clearing videos. Thank you.